Have you ever heard the whispers of an empire so old its kings were half gods, and its heroes wrestled with celestial bulls? We're talking about a time when the world was new, when cities were just beginning to crawl out of the mud, and the very idea of a story was still being invented. It's a place where the king was a tyrant, the gods were fickle, and the line between mortal and divine was as thin as a thread. Imagine a city called Uruk, its walls so magnificent they were said to scrape the heavens, its people bustling with the anxieties and aspirations we still feel today, yet living under the shadow of a king who could do whatever he pleased. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening in, why not drop a comment with where you are and what time it is for you right now? Let's all get cozy together. Now, imagine, if you will, a long, long time ago, a place called Mesopotamia, nestled between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. The air hung thick with the smell of wet clay and dust, and the sky, a vast, unchanging blue, was the only thing that seemed truly permanent. Here, in the city of Uruk, a king named Gilgamesh was born. He was not like other men. They said he was two-thirds god and one-third man, a strange, potent combination that made him stronger, faster, and more beautiful than any who had come before him. He was born with a kind of restless energy, a divine spark that burned so hot it threatened to consume him. And at first, that's exactly what it did. He ruled with an iron fist, a tyrant in a world that didn't yet have a word for it. He took the sons for his army, the daughters for his pleasure, and he built his magnificent city walls on the backs of his exhausted people. They were a bit like that one neighbor who always has to have the loudest lawnmower at 7 a.m. on a Sunday. It's annoying, but what can you do? The people of Uruk, worn down by his relentless demands, cried out to the gods. Their prayers, a mixture of despair and supplication, rose on the warm air like smoke from a cook fire. The gods, listening from their celestial abode, heard them and took counsel. The god Anu, the father of the gods, listened to the pleas of the weary citizens and decided that something had to be done. He called upon the goddess of creation, Aruru, and instructed her to create a being who could be Gilgamesh's equal, a creature to challenge his unchecked power, and perhaps even temper his wild spirit. Aruru, with the elegance of a potter working with clay, dipped her hands into the cosmic waters and fashioned a man out of a lump of wet earth and divine spittle. A little gross, I know, but let's not judge their creative process. This new being was called Enkidu, and he was as wild as Gilgamesh was civilized. He lived among the animals in the steppes, eating grass with the gazelles and drinking from the same watering holes. His body was covered in hair, and his strength was a natural, untamed force, a pure, earthy power. He was Gilgamesh's opposite in every way. The people of Uruk heard rumors of this wild man, a trapper whose livelihood was being ruined by Enkidu, freeing his captured animals, brought back tales of a powerful hairy beastman. He described a being of such strength that he could tear apart traps with his bare hands. Gilgamesh, bored with his mundane tyranny and always looking for a new challenge, sent a temple prostitute, a harlot named Shamhat, to civilize Enkidu. This was a common practice in ancient Mesopotamian culture, a way of bringing the wild into the fold of civilization. which I have to say is a rather unique job description. Shamat went to the watering hole, where Enkidu drank with the animals and waited. When he arrived, she revealed her presence, and for 6 days and 7 nights, she taught him the ways of mankind. She showed him how to eat bread and drink beer, how to wear clothing, and how to speak. Slowly but surely, Enkidu began to shed his animal instincts and embrace his humanity. His mind, once focused only on the simple rhythms of nature, began to open up to the complexities of civilization. Historians still argue whether the figure of Gilgamesh was a real king who was later mythologized or a purely mythical figure from the start. But what's undeniable is that his story, passed down on cuneiform tablets, speaks to a deeply human truth. It's the story of a man wrestling with his own nature, with his power, and with his place in the world. As Enkidu became more human, the animals, who once accepted him as one of their own, now shunned him. He was no longer a part of their world. He was alone, caught between two existences. Shamat, sensing his loneliness, told him about Gilgamesh and the great city of Uruk, a place where people lived in community and purpose. She told him that Gilgamesh was a king, mighty and strong, but that he lacked a true friend, someone who could challenge him and make him a better man. The idea of friendship, of a bond beyond the simple companionship he had with the animals, was new and fascinating to Enkidu. He decided to go to Uruk to meet this king who was his mirror image, his fated other. So it was that Enkidu, now clothed and speaking like a man, made his way to Uruk. As he approached the city, the sheer scale of it must have been overwhelming. The bustling markets, the towering ziggurat, and the immense fortified walls that Gilgamesh had so cruelly built all stood as a testament to the power of human civilization. He saw the people, their faces etched with a weary resignation, and his heart filled with a righteous anger for their king. When he finally arrived at the city gates, the people were in awe of him. He was a marvel, a wild man brought into the fold, and they whispered stories about his strength. He was a force of nature in a city built to control nature, and the sight of him must have been a little like seeing a bear suddenly show up at your local coffee shop. You're impressed, but also a little scared. Word soon reached Gilgamesh that his equal had arrived, a man who challenged his very authority just by existing. Gilgamesh, ever the showman, had a dream that night. He dreamt of a meteorite that fell to earth, so powerful and beautiful that he couldn't lift it. And the people of Uruk gathered around it, worshipping it. His mother, the goddess Ninsun, interpreted the dream for him, saying that the meteorite represented a powerful companion who would become his dearest friend. Gilgamesh, a king used to getting his own way, wasn't having it. He was a man god, and no one was his equal. He prepared to face this new rival, and so the two titans met in the center of the city. Enkidu, seeing the way Gilgamesh was treating the people, forcing them to bow, taking whatever he pleased, blocked his path. The air crackled with tension. They were a study in contrasts. Gilgamesh, with his finely braided beard and luxurious robes, stood as a monument to refined power. Enkidu, with his tangled hair and simple clothes, was the embodiment of raw, unadulterated strength. They locked eyes, and a wordless challenge passed between them. The fight that followed was something straight out of a Hollywood blockbuster, a seismic clash that shook the very foundations of Uruk. They grappled in the streets, a storm of dust and muscle and fury. The houses trembled, and the city walls seemed to groan under the strain of their titanic struggle. They wrestled for hours, their bodies slick with sweat and the ancient dust of the city. Gilgamesh, for the first time in his life, met a force that matched his own, a will as unbending as his. Neither could gain a decisive advantage, and the fight eventually devolved into a stalemate, their bodies exhausted, but their spirits still unbroken. Finally, they stopped, panting, and looked at each other, not with hatred, but with a newfound respect. It was the moment a bully finds someone who won't back down, and the surprising result is that they become best friends. From that moment on, their lives were forever intertwined. The tyrannical Gilgamesh, who had known no one but himself, found in Enkidu a true companion, a brother. Enkidu, who had been alone in the wild, found in Gilgamesh a purpose and a friendship that transcended the natural world. Together, they formed an unbreakable bond, a partnership that would shape the destiny of Uruk. Their friendship tempered Gilgamesh's cruelty. He stopped his tyrannical ways, and the people of Uruk, who had once cried out against him, now rejoiced at the change. The two friends were inseparable, wandering the city, sharing stories, and embarking on new adventures. The restless energy that had once made Gilgamesh a tyrant was now channeled into something productive, something noble. Their first great adventure was not a hunt or a conquest, but a quest for glory, a desire to leave a mark on the world that would outlast them. They wanted to do something that had never been done before, to create a name for themselves that would echo through the ages. Gilgamesh proposed a journey to the legendary cedar forest, a sacred grove guarded by a terrible monster named Humbaba. The gods, with a slightly sarcastic sense of humor, had placed Humbaba there to protect the forest from mortals. Humbaba was no ordinary monster. His roar was a flood, his mouth was fire, and his breath was death. The thought of facing such a beast would have terrified any normal man. But for Gilgamesh and Enkidu, it was a challenge they couldn't refuse. The elder citizens of Uruk, the wise old men who had seen kings come and go, tried to dissuade them. They warned of Humbaba's great power and the dangers of the long journey. Even Enkidu, with his intimate knowledge of the wild, was hesitant. He knew the creatures of the world, and he knew that Humbaba was something more, a supernatural force of nature. But Gilgamesh, fueled by his hubris and a thirst for glory, was resolute. He convinced Enkidu that this was their destiny, their chance to achieve immortality through fame, a legacy that would outlive their mortal bodies. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest surviving works of literature, giving us a glimpse into a time when heroes were not just strong, but also deeply flawed. Before they left, Gilgamesh prayed to the sun god Shamash, a deity known for his justice and protection, to bless their journey. The people of Uruk, though they feared for their king, lined the streets to see them off. The two friends, clad in their finest armor and carrying their mighty weapons, set out on the long, dusty road to the cedar forest, a journey that would change both of them forever. And so, the two heroes, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, began their long and arduous journey to the cedar forest. The path was not a well-worn one. It was a journey into the wild, a place where civilization's rules didn't apply. They traveled for what felt like weeks, over dusty plains and through rocky passes, their sandals worn thin and their bodies growing accustomed to the brutal rhythm of the road. Each night, they would make camp under the vast, star-filled Mesopotamian sky, a blanket of tiny, flickering lights that seemed to watch them silently. Gilgamesh would dream, and his dreams were filled with omens and portents. He would see mountains crumbling or bulls charging, and with each terrifying vision, he would wake up in a cold sweat. It was Enkidu, the man who was once a part of the wild, who now comforted him, interpreting his dreams and reassuring him that the omens were not of death, but of triumph. It was a beautiful role reversal. The king, once so self-assured, now relied on the man who had been created to humble him. The deeper they ventured, the more the landscape began to change. The air grew cooler, and the scent of the cedar trees, a fragrance both sweet and sharp, began to fill their lungs. They were entering a sacred place, a grove so ancient that the trees were said to be the very pillars of the god's home. The cedar forest was a world unto itself, a place of deep shadows and hushed light, where the sun struggled to pierce the dense canopy. It was a bit like walking into a massive, natural cathedral, with a silence so profound you could almost hear your own heartbeat. This was the domain of Humbaba, the monster placed there by the gods to guard the precious wood and the sacred silence. Humbaba's presence was a palpable thing, a force that seemed to press down on them, a low hum of malevolence that vibrated through the ground. Humbaba was a being of pure terror, a composite of monstrous features. His face was a contorted mass, his body covered in plates of armor, and his breath was so foul it was said to bring pestilence and rot. He was the embodiment of the untamed wilderness, a creature that existed solely to protect his home from the encroachment of mankind. When they finally came face to face with him, he was as terrifying as the stories had claimed. He roared, and the very trees around them shook. He charged, and the ground trembled beneath his heavy feet. The air was thick with the dust he kicked up, and the pungent smell of his monstrous breath. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu, a tag team for the ages, were not afraid. They were a bit like a duo in a video game, each with their own special skills, ready to take on the final boss. The battle that followed was a symphony of violence and determination. Gilgamesh, with his heroic strength, attacked Humbaba with his great axe, while Enkidu, using his speed and agility, danced around the monster, distracting him and looking for an opening. The fight raged on for a long time, a brutal dance of man against monster. Humbaba, for all his monstrous power, was surprised. He was used to mortals running away in fear, not standing their ground. He was a guardian, not a warrior, and the two friends, with their combined force and unwavering courage, began to wear him down. Just as Humbaba seemed to be faltering, the sun god Shamash, whom Gilgamesh had prayed to, saw their struggle. Moved by their bravery, Shamash sent 13 great winds to bind Humbaba, winds that swirled around the monster, trapping him and making him helpless. With Humbaba now immobilized, Gilgamesh stood over him, his axe raised for the final blow. But Humbaba, seeing his imminent defeat, began to plead for his life. He appealed to Gilgamesh's sense of compassion, promising to serve him and to give him all the cedar wood he desired. Gilgamesh, for a moment, wavered. There was a part of him, a sliver of his human half, that felt pity for this defeated creature. But Enkidu, hardened by his time in the wild and remembering the original purpose of their quest, urged him on. He reminded Gilgamesh that a monster cannot be trusted, that the gods had sent them to defeat him, and that glory, not mercy, was their goal. The temptation to let Humbaba live and become a loyal servant was there. But Enkidu knew better. He knew that the only way to truly defeat a force of nature is to destroy it. Historians still argue whether the decision to kill Humbaba was a heroic act or a moment of tragic short-sightedness that would lead to later suffering for the two heroes. Gilgamesh, listening to his friend, made the hard choice. He raised his axe, and with one final, decisive blow, ended Humbaba's life. With Humbaba dead, the sacred silence of the forest was broken forever. The heroes began to cut down the great cedar trees, the very reason for their journey. They hewed the wood, bundling it together, and prepared to take it back to Uruk, a victory trophy of their grand conquest. But in their hubris, they had gone too far. They had not only defeated a monster, but they had also desecrated a sacred place, a sanctuary of the gods. And the gods, as Gilgamesh would soon learn, were not known for their forgiveness. With Humbaba defeated and the great cedar trees cut down, Gilgamesh and Enkidu began their triumphant journey back to Uruk, a victory march 1,000 miles long. They had faced a terrifying beast, conquered the sacred forest, and now they carried the spoils of their victory, the priceless cedar logs, on their shoulders. As they traveled, the mood was one of elation. They had done the impossible. They had cemented their names in legend. The air, once thick with the scent of fear, now smelled of success and the sweet, resinous aroma of the freshly cut cedar. It was a good time to be a hero, a time when a simple act of chopping down a tree could make you a legend. Upon their return, the people of Uruk were overjoyed. They had been worried, had prayed for their king's safety, and now they welcomed him back with a celebration worthy of a conqueror. The cedar logs were used to build a magnificent new gate for the city temple, a lasting monument to Gilgamesh and Enkidu's bravery. The king, once a tyrant, was now a celebrated hero, and his friendship with Enkidu was the stuff of legends. They were the dynamic duo of ancient Mesopotamia, a team that could face down any challenge, human or divine. It was during this time of peace and prosperity that Gilgamesh's good looks caught the attention of the gods, specifically the goddess Ishtar. She was the goddess of love, war, and fertility, a complex and powerful deity who was not used to being ignored. She saw Gilgamesh in all his glory, his strength and his fame, and she was smitten. She approached him and proposed marriage, promising him untold riches, a chariot of lapis lazuli, and a kingdom filled with a constant supply of beautiful people. It was a pretty sweet deal, the kind of offer that would make even the most successful person in the world stop and consider it. But Gilgamesh, a man who had now been humbled by the wild and who had found a true friend, was not so easily swayed by power or lust. He looked at Ishtar, this beautiful and powerful goddess, and he saw through her promises. He knew her history, a long list of lovers who had met terrible fates at her hands. He recalled the poor shepherd who became a wolf, the bird who had his wings broken, and the lion who was trapped in a pit. Gilgamesh, with a wisdom born of his recent trials, looked at her and said, "What would I get in return for your love? For you are like a poorly sealed jug that leaks on its bearer." Ouch, that's a burn that would make even the most seasoned modern stand-up comedian blush. He rejected her, not with fear, but with a kind of righteous indignation, a sense that he was a man who was no longer a plaything for the gods. Ishtar, her ego bruised and her divine pride wounded, was not used to being rejected, especially not by a mortal. She was furious, her anger a storm of divine rage. She went straight to her father, Anu, the father of the gods, and demanded vengeance. She threatened to release the dead from the underworld, a truly terrifying prospect. If Anu did not grant her a way to punish Gilgamesh, the gods, as a general rule, don't like their divine order being messed with. So Anu, reluctantly, gave in to his daughter's demands. He agreed to release the Bull of Heaven, a fearsome creature of immense power, to wreak havoc on Uruk. Historians still argue whether Ishtar's rage was a result of genuine love turned to scorn, or a simple, divine tantrum over a bruised ego. But what's clear is that the people of Uruk were about to pay the price. The Bull of Heaven descended from the sky like a force of nature, a creature of pure destruction. It was an apocalyptic event, a beast of such immense size that with every snort of its nostrils, it created fissures in the earth. The bull rampaged through the city, its thundering hooves causing buildings to crumble and the ground to shake. Its immense size was such that every time it roared, it killed hundreds of men, their bodies shattered by the sheer force of the sound. The people of Uruk, who had just been celebrating their hero, now cowered in fear. Their joy turned to despair. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu, the two friends, stood ready. They were the only ones who could face this divine beast. They knew they had to work together, their skills complementing each other perfectly. Gilgamesh, the brute force, would attack the bull head-on, while Enkidu, with his knowledge of the wild, would find a way to get around its defenses. They met the bull in the city square, a monumental confrontation that seemed to hang in the balance. It was a classic showdown, two heroes against a single, overpowering force, and they were about to show the world that sometimes two is stronger than one, especially when one of them is a half-god and the other is a former wild man who knows his way around a celestial beast. The Bull of Heaven, a celestial creature of raw power, was now in the heart of Uruk, a city it was designed to obliterate. The people, as you can imagine, had scattered like dust in a windstorm, leaving the two heroes to face the beast alone. This wasn't a scene from a children's story, where a monster is just a big, scary thing that can be easily outsmarted. This was a divine animal, a walking, snorting catastrophe that represented the very real and terrifying anger of a goddess scorned. Gilgamesh and Enkidu, however, were not intimidated. This was what they had been created for, what their newfound friendship had been forged to accomplish. The bull charged, its hooves creating a chasm in the earth with every step, its immense horns aimed squarely at Gilgamesh. But Gilgamesh, with a flash of his godlike speed, sidestepped the attack. He was like a matador, but instead of a red cape, he had an iron will and a very big axe. While the bull's head was momentarily turned, Enkidu, using his primal knowledge of animal weak points, darted in. He grabbed the bull by the tail, pulling it off balance and creating a momentary opening. Gilgamesh saw his chance. He leapt onto the bull's back, his great weight momentarily stunning the creature. But the bull, a being of immense power, was not so easily subdued. It bucked and thrashed, a whirlwind of muscle and rage. Gilgamesh held on with a tenacity that would make a rodeo cowboy jealous. The battle raged through the city streets, a chaotic dance of death and survival. Houses were flattened, walls were crumbled, and the air was filled with the deafening roar of the bull and the determined shouts of the two heroes. They were a perfect team, a symphony of brute force and primal cunning. Enkidu, with a swift movement, dodged a flailing hoof and plunged his sword into the bull's neck, a precise blow that finally brought the beast to its knees. Gilgamesh, seeing the bull weakened, delivered the final fatal blow. It was over. The bull of heaven, a symbol of divine wrath, lay dead in the streets of Uruk, its enormous body a testament to the power of two friends working together. The people of Uruk, seeing their city saved, rushed out from their hiding places to cheer their heroes. They hailed them as saviors, their names now on every lip, their triumph a new chapter in the city's history. Gilgamesh, in a show of bravado, tore out the bull's heart and offered it to the sun god Shamash as a sign of respect and thanks. It was a proud moment, a triumph of man over the divine, a moment when they truly felt they were invincible. But their victory was not without a cost. Remember that they had not only killed the bull, but they had also publicly humiliated the goddess Ishtar. And the gods, as we know, are not ones to forget or forgive a slight. The gods gathered in their celestial council to discuss the fate of the two mortals who had defied them. Anu, the father of the gods, was not pleased. He decreed that either Gilgamesh or Enkidu must die as punishment for killing Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest, and for slaying the bull of heaven. Ishtar, still fuming, demanded that it be Gilgamesh, but the other gods, particularly Shamash, the sun god who had helped the heroes, argued on their behalf. In the end, a compromise was reached. The gods chose Enkidu. The death of the wild man, the one who had guided Gilgamesh and who had a more direct connection to the natural world, was seen as a suitable punishment. It was a cruel irony. Enkidu was not being punished for his own actions, but for the success of his friend. Enkidu fell ill. The divine illness was not a normal sickness, but a slow, consuming malaise that wore him down, body and spirit. He suffered for 12 days and 12 nights, his strength ebbing away with each passing hour. He cursed the trapper, the harlot Shamhat, and the day he was ever civilized, blaming them for his fate. But as he lay dying, the sun god Shamash appeared to him in a vision and reminded him of the love and friendship he had found with Gilgamesh, of the purpose he had in a life he would have never known. Enkidu, seeing the truth, retracted his curses and accepted his fate. Gilgamesh, watching his friend suffer, was helpless. He was a half-god, a mighty warrior, but he couldn't fight a divine illness. This was a different kind of monster, one he couldn't defeat with a sword or a shield. It was a truly heartbreaking moment, a lesson that even the most powerful men are ultimately powerless in the face of death. Finally, Enkidu died. His last breath was a sigh, a final release from his tormented body. Gilgamesh, who had known only power and conquest, now knew the bitter, soul-crushing agony of loss. He wept for his friend for 7 days and 7 nights, a profound and sorrowful mourning that echoed through the empty halls of his palace. He held Enkidu's body, refusing to let go, until a maggot fell from his friend's nose. It was at this gruesome, humbling moment that Gilgamesh was finally forced to confront the terrible reality of death. It was a universal truth, a lesson that every single human being has to learn, no matter how powerful they are. This realization, a cold, hard slap of reality, would change Gilgamesh forever. He was no longer a king concerned with glory, but a man haunted by the specter of his own mortality. With Enkidu's body finally laid to rest, Gilgamesh's grief turned into a profound and all-consuming fear. The death of his friend wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a mirror, a reflection of his own mortality. He had seen the raw, undeniable finality of death, and it terrified him. He, a half-god, the king of a great city, was just as vulnerable as any other man. His strength, his fame, his magnificent walls, none of it could save him from the inevitability of the grave. The once proud king, who had faced down monsters and gods, was now a man haunted by a single, terrifying question. If death can take Enkidu, my dear friend, what is to stop it from taking me? He could not stay in Uruk. The city, once a symbol of his power, now felt like a cage, its walls a grim reminder of his own limitations. Everywhere he looked, he saw the ghost of Enkidu, a painful memory of their shared adventures. He shed his fine, kingly robes and donned the skin of an animal, a ragged, unkempt covering that mirrored the chaos in his heart. His hair grew long and tangled, and his once clean-shaven face was now a mess of beard. He was a king who had become a wild man, a reversal of his friend's journey. He left the comfort and safety of his city and began a desperate, solitary journey, a quest not for glory or treasure, but for the one thing that had always eluded him: eternal life. His journey was a long, dusty road, a path that led him through deserts and over mountains. He walked for days, his mind a maelstrom of sorrow and fear. He encountered strange beasts, creatures of the wilderness that he once would have fought for sport. But now he just walked past them, a man with a single-minded purpose. His destination was a secret, whispered only in the most ancient of tales. He was searching for Utnapishtim, a man who had survived the Great Flood and had been granted immortality by the gods. Utnapishtim was the only person who could tell him the secret to escaping death, and Gilgamesh was willing to travel to the ends of the earth to find him. His quest took him to the mountain of Mashu, a place where the sun rose and set, guarded by scorpion men. These were not the little scuttling bugs you'd find in the desert, but monstrous half-man, half-scorpion beings with a terrifying stare that was said to bring instant death. Gilgamesh, however, was no longer afraid of a stare. He was so consumed by his fear of death that nothing else mattered. He approached them, and the Scorpion Man, seeing the desperation in his eyes, was moved. He saw that Gilgamesh was a man in deep distress, a man who had lost everything. He told Gilgamesh that the path to Utnapishtim lay through the mountain, but that it was a path of utter darkness, a journey that no mortal had ever completed. Gilgamesh, without hesitation, stepped into the mountain's maw. He walked for 12 leagues in pitch black, a darkness so profound that it was like being buried alive. He could feel nothing, see nothing, and the silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket. He pressed on, his feet moving on their own accord, a single light in his heart guiding him forward, the desperate hope of immortality. He emerged from the other side, blinking in the sudden, dazzling light of the sun. He found himself in a beautiful garden, a place of jeweled trees and fragrant bushes, a paradise that seemed to mock his ragged appearance. The fruit on the trees was made of precious stones, and the leaves were of lapis lazuli. It was a place of divine beauty, a stark contrast to the dark path he had just walked. In this garden, he met a tavern keeper named Siduri, a kind and wise woman who saw his sorrow and his strange appearance. She was afraid of him at first, seeing his wild hair and haggard face, but Gilgamesh told her his story, his quest, and his fear. Siduri listened, and her heart went out to him. She told him that his quest was a fool's errand, that all men are fated to die. She advised him to return to Uruk, to clean himself, and to enjoy the simple pleasures of life, to eat, to drink, to dance, and to hold his family close. She gave him the kind of sage advice you'd hear from a wise old grandma, telling him to just live in the moment. But Gilgamesh, a man obsessed, would not be swayed. He insisted on finding Utnapishtim. Siduri, seeing that he was determined, finally relented and pointed him toward Ushanabi, the ferryman who could take him across the waters of death, a perilous sea that no man could cross without divine guidance. It was a river that brought instant death to any who touched it. Gilgamesh, without a moment's hesitation, sought out the ferryman. The road to immortality was getting more complicated than a modern tax form. But Gilgamesh was undeterred. Gilgamesh, still a mess of long hair and animal skins, found the ferryman Ushanabi at the edge of the waters of death. This wasn't your average ferry ride across a placid lake. This was a supernatural crossing, a journey over a sea whose very waters were toxic to mortals. To touch them meant instant, agonizing death. Urshanabi, seeing Gilgamesh's desperate state, was not exactly thrilled to see him. He looked at the haggard king and asked, "Who are you, you wild-looking man, and why do you stand here?" Gilgamesh, a man now used to telling his tale of woe, recounted his entire story, his loss, and his quest for Utnapishtim. Urshanabi, hearing the story, saw the raw grief and fear behind the disheveled appearance. He also saw that Gilgamesh, in a fit of rage or frustration, had destroyed the sacred stone images that were used to navigate the treacherous waters. These stone images were the ancient world's version of a GPS, a little stone chart that showed where the currents were safe and where they were deadly. Gilgamesh, in his haste and emotional distress, had smashed them. It was a classic case of breaking the very thing you need to get to your destination. Ushanabi, a bit exasperated, explained that without the stones, the journey would be almost impossible. He told Gilgamesh that the only way to get across was to cut down 120 poles, a specific number and a back-breaking task, to propel the boat across the deadly waters without his hands ever touching them. So, Gilgamesh, the king who had once made his people do all the hard labor, now had to perform this monumental task himself. He took his great axe and began to chop down trees, one after another, his muscles straining, his hands blistering. He worked relentlessly, driven by the single, burning desire to find immortality. It was a humbling moment for him, a prince of a man forced to do the work of a common laborer. He was like a billionaire who suddenly finds himself stranded on a deserted island and has to learn how to build a fire for the first time. It's a hard lesson, but a necessary one. He finally finished the task, each pole a silent witness to his determination. With the poles now ready, they began the perilous journey across the waters of death. Urshanabi sat at the stern, a solemn guide, while Gilgamesh, using one pole after another, pushed the boat forward. As soon as a pole touched the deadly water, it was instantly disintegrated. Gilgamesh would then grab another one, his movements a blur of desperate urgency. The journey was a slow, terrifying crawl, with the threat of death hanging over them with every stroke. This was a test of his physical strength, his endurance, and perhaps most importantly, his will to live. He was a man fighting for his very existence, and the stakes could not have been higher. Finally, after a long and grueling journey, they reached the other side. They had crossed the uncrossable, a testament to Gilgamesh's unwavering resolve. And there, on a shore of shimmering sand, was Utnapishtim, the immortal man, the last survivor of the great flood. Utnapishtim was an old, wise man who had seen the rise and fall of countless generations. He looked at Gilgamesh, this wild-haired mortal who had crossed a sea of death, and he saw a man consumed by grief and fear. He could see the sorrow in his eyes and the desperation in his stance, a familiar sight for one who had witnessed the full spectrum of human suffering. Gilgamesh, breathless and exhausted from his journey, immediately began to tell his story, his voice a mix of awe and anguish. He asked Utnapishtim, "How is it that you, a man, were granted eternal life? Tell me your secret, for I have seen death, and I am terrified." He was essentially asking for the cheat code to life, a simple answer to the most complex of questions. Utnapishtim, however, was not one to give out secrets easily. He looked at Gilgamesh with a sad, knowing expression and told him that his search was a fool's errand. He said that death is a part of the human condition, an unchangeable fate that all mortals must face. He explained that a man's life is a cycle, a fleeting moment between two vast eternities, and that to fight against it is to fight against the very nature of the world. Scholarly debates still rage about how much the tale of Utnapishtim and the Great Flood influenced later religious and mythological texts, particularly the story of Noah's Ark. But what's clear is that the message was a sobering one. Utnapishtim was trying to teach Gilgamesh a profound lesson, that immortality wasn't something you could win or find. It was a state of being that was not meant for mortals. Gilgamesh was heartbroken, but still desperate. He insisted that there must be a way, a test, a chance for him to escape his fate. Utnapishtim, seeing the stubborn refusal to accept his counsel, decided to give him one last chance. It would be a test, not of strength, but of will, a final challenge to prove if Gilgamesh was worthy of the gift he so desperately sought. Utnapishtim, with a sigh born of 1,000 years of watching mortals chase after fleeting hopes, decided to give Gilgamesh a test. This wasn't a test of strength, a battle against a monster, or a long journey over a deadly sea. This was a test of something far more difficult for Gilgamesh, his own will. Utnapishtim looked at the exhausted king and said, "Sleep is the twin brother of death. If you cannot conquer sleep, how can you conquer death? Stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights, and you shall have the eternal life you seek." It seemed simple enough, right? Just stay awake. Gilgamesh, a man who had faced down gods and bulls, thought this would be a piece of cake. He sat down and prepared himself, his eyes wide with determination, his mind fixated on the promise of immortality. He was a man-god, and a little thing like sleep was not going to get in his way. But the moment he sat down, the deep fatigue from his long journey, from the endless walking and the constant fear, began to creep in. His eyelids, heavy with the weight of his monumental quest, began to droop. He fought it. He really did, trying to stay awake, to resist the gentle pull of oblivion. But he failed. He fell into a deep, profound sleep, the kind of sleep that only comes after a long, exhausting struggle. Utnapishtim, however, was not one to be fooled. He was a man who had seen the whole of human history unfold, and he knew that mortals are full of big talk, but often lack the staying power. He saw Gilgamesh fall asleep almost immediately. To prove to Gilgamesh that he had failed, Utnapishtim asked his wife to bake a loaf of bread for every day that Gilgamesh slept, and to place it beside him. The loaves were a physical record of his failure, a silent witness to his lack of resolve. When Gilgamesh finally awoke, 6 days and 7 nights later, he saw the loaves of bread beside him, each one at a different stage of decay. The first loaf was hard and moldy, the last one still soft and fresh. It was a crushing revelation. He had failed the test before it had even begun. He had not just failed to stay awake. He had failed to even realize he was asleep. It was a cruel and brilliant way to show him the true nature of his mortality and his limitations. Gilgamesh was heartbroken. He had come so far, fought so hard, only to be defeated by something so mundane and human as sleep. He wept, a sorrowful sound that echoed the emptiness he now felt. He realized the truth of Utnapishtim's words. He was not meant to be immortal. He was a man, a mortal, and he was destined to die. It was a profound moment of acceptance, the kind of moment that changes a person forever. He had to accept that his journey was over, that his quest was a failure, and that he would have to return home empty-handed. Utnapishtim, seeing his genuine sorrow and his newfound wisdom, took pity on him. Even though Gilgamesh had failed, he had at least shown a new humility. Utnapishtim, with a kindness that seemed out of place for an immortal, decided to give him a parting gift. He told Gilgamesh of a secret, a plant that grew at the bottom of the sea, a plant that had the power to restore youth. It was not immortality, but it was the next best thing. He told Gilgamesh to tie heavy stones to his feet and to dive deep into the sea to retrieve it. It was a small act of kindness, a final hope offered to a man who had lost everything. The plant was a bit like a magical youth serum, a little something to make the long road back a little easier. Gilgamesh, his spirit now buoyed by this new hope, did as he was told. He tied the heavy stones to his feet and plunged into the churning sea. He swam down, 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 until he reached the seabed. There, amidst the murky depths, he saw the plant, a beautiful, prickly flower that glowed with a faint, ethereal light. He was not a man who had spent his life swimming in the ocean, so this was a truly monumental effort for him. He grabbed the plant and, with a monumental push, broke free from the seabed and shot up to the surface, a man holding his second chance in his hands. He was triumphant, a hero once again. He had found something of immense value, and he was ready to return home and share it with his people. Gilgamesh, with the magical plant of youth now clutched in his hand, was a man reborn. The sorrow and fear that had consumed him were now replaced with a soaring hope. He had failed the test of immortality, but he had found something almost as good, chance to restore his youth, and perhaps, in doing so, to share a piece of his miraculous journey with his people. He and Urshanabi, the trusty ferryman, began the long journey back to Uruk, a journey that now felt less like a desperate flight and more like a victorious march. The journey home was long and hot. The Mesopotamian sun beat down on them, and the landscape was a blur of dusty browns and sun-bleached yellows. At one point, Gilgamesh, exhausted from the long trek and the immense emotional journey he had been on, decided to stop and rest by a cool, clear pool of water. It was a perfect spot, a little oasis in the middle of a vast, unforgiving desert. He placed the precious plant on the ground beside him, its luminous glow a stark contrast to the drab scenery. He stripped off his travel-worn clothes and plunged into the cool water, his body sighing with relief. But he made a mistake that would have been obvious to a man more in touch with the natural world, a mistake that his dear friend Enkidu would have never made. He left the plant unguarded. As he was cooling off in the water, a snake, drawn by the sweet fragrance of the plant, slithered silently from its hiding place. It was a common serpent, a creature of the earth, but it was about to commit a cosmic act of theft. It snatched the plant, its fangs closing around the precious stem, and in a flash, it ate the plant, its body shedding its old skin as it did so, a symbol of its own renewal. The serpent, now full of the plant's youth-restoring properties, slithered away, leaving behind its old skin as the only evidence of its crime. It's a bit like finding out the winning lottery ticket you left on the table has been chewed up by your dog. It's a small event with massive, life-altering consequences. Gilgamesh emerged from the water and saw the empty space where the plant had been. He saw the discarded snakeskin, and a wave of profound despair washed over him. He fell to his knees, weeping, his shoulders shaking with a grief that was almost unbearable. He had come so far, endured so much, only to lose the prize at the very last moment. He had wrestled with gods, conquered monsters, and crossed a sea of death, but he had been defeated by a simple, hungry snake. It was the most human of all defeats, a reminder that no matter how great you are, sometimes life just throws you a curveball that you can't hit. Ushanabi, seeing his friend's sorrow, sat with him, offering him a silent, empathetic presence. There was nothing to say, The loss was too great, the irony too cruel. Gilgamesh, a man who had left his city in search of immortality, had now lost even the chance for a second youth. He was back to square one, but worse off. He had nothing to show for his journey but his experience and his heartache. This was a man who had faced the great existential questions of life and death, and he had come up with no easy answers. After a period of mourning, Gilgamesh, with a newfound sense of humility, stood up and looked at his friend. He had to go back. There was nothing else he could do. He had to return to Uruk, the city he had abandoned in his selfish quest. But this time, he was not going back as a king in search of glory or a hero with a new prize. He was going back as a man who had been humbled by life, a man who had lost everything but had, in the process, found a new kind of wisdom. The journey back was a quiet one. The boisterousness and bravado that had once defined him were gone, replaced by a quiet, thoughtful resignation. He had learned that you cannot cheat death, and that to try is to lose sight of the beauty of life. Historians still argue about the exact symbolism of the snake stealing the plant, but the general consensus is that it represents the cyclical nature of life and death. The snake, an animal that sheds its skin, represents rebirth, while Gilgamesh, a mortal, is left to face the finality of his own existence. The journey back to Uruk was nothing like the triumphant return they had anticipated. There was no victory march, no celebration, just a quiet, somber procession of a king and his loyal ferryman. The king, once so full of a youthful, arrogant energy, was now a man of quiet contemplation. He had gone on a quest for immortality and had found nothing but sorrow and loss. But in that loss, something new had been born. As he approached the city, he looked at its magnificent walls, the very walls he had built with such cruelty and pride. But this time, he didn't see a monument to his power. He saw a monument to his people, to their strength, and to their resilience. When he entered the city, the people who had been waiting for their king's return were shocked by his appearance. They had expected a triumphant hero, but they saw a humbled, haggard man. He was no longer a king who was two-thirds God. He was a man who had faced his own humanity and had, in a sense, lost. But this loss was also his greatest victory. He was no longer a tyrant. He was a man who understood suffering, who had felt the bitter sting of grief and the cold touch of mortality. This new Gilgamesh, a wiser and more compassionate man, began to rule Uruk with a newfound kindness. He used his immense strength not to oppress his people, but to protect them. He was a leader who had been to the ends of the earth and had come back with a profound understanding of what truly matters. He became a just and fair ruler, a king who listened to his people and worked for their well-being. The massive walls he had built, once a symbol of his tyranny, were now a source of pride for the city, a testament to its strength and a promise of security. He used his knowledge and his power to make Uruk a true center of civilization, a place where art and culture flourished. He had been a hero, a conqueror, but his greatest legacy was not the monsters he defeated or the lands he conquered. It was the wisdom he had gained and the compassionate reign he had initiated. He had learned that the only way to achieve immortality was not to live forever, but to live a life that would be remembered, a life that would leave a lasting impact on the world. The story of Gilgamesh became a lesson for the people of Uruk, a tale of a king's journey from arrogance to humility, a lesson that would be passed down from generation to generation. The ancient Sumerians, as well as later scholars, knew that a ruler who lacks wisdom and compassion is not a king, but a tyrant. Gilgamesh, a man who had once been the very definition of a tyrant, had become a true king. He had been a person who was so full of himself that he couldn't see the humanity in others, but his journey had forced him to see it in himself. He had found his humanity in the loss of his friend, in the failure of his quest, and in the quiet acceptance of his own fate. He lived out his days in Uruk, a king beloved by his people. He had found peace, not in avoiding death, but in accepting it. His final years were not a desperate flight from the inevitable, but a quiet, thoughtful time of reflection and leadership. He had lived a full life, a life of adventure, of love, of loss, and finally, of wisdom. The story ends not with his death, but with the legacy he left behind, a legacy of a changed heart and a great civilization. And when he finally did die, he did so with the quiet dignity of a man who had lived his life to the fullest, a man who had learned that the most important journey is not to the ends of the earth, but into the depths of your own heart. He was a king who had built a kingdom not just of stone, but of wisdom and compassion, a kingdom that would be remembered long after the physical walls had crumbled to dust. With Gilgamesh's journey now complete, and his wisdom a new guiding light for his reign, Uruk entered what could only be called its Silver Age. The term isn't an official historical one, of course, but it fits the mood perfectly. It was a time of unprecedented peace and flourishing prosperity, a direct result of Gilgamesh's transformation. The old, brutal ways were gone, replaced by a king who understood the value of his people's lives and happiness. He saw the city not as a monument to himself, but as a living, breathing entity that deserved care and respect. It was a complete 180 from the arrogant kid who used to run around terrorizing everyone, a testament to the power of a good, old-fashioned wake-up call. This era of peace allowed the people of Uruk to focus on things other than survival. The city's markets buzzed with the chatter of merchants. Its streets were clean and orderly, and the great ziggurat, once a symbol of fear, was now a place of worship and community. Gilgamesh, no longer focused on chasing immortality, turned his attention to more tangible projects. He commissioned artisans to create beautiful works of art, encouraged scholars to record the city's history, and oversaw the construction of new temples and public buildings. This was not just a period of building, but a period of cultural creation. They were not just making things, they were creating a culture. The most profound change, however, was in the people's relationship with their king. They no longer feared him, they admired him. They saw a man who had faced the great unknown and had come back not with answers, but with a humility that was far more valuable than any magical plant. They saw a leader who had grieved like one of them, and who understood that life, for all its fleeting nature, was a precious thing. He had become a true shepherd of his people, a protector instead of an oppressor. The relationship was built on trust, a solid foundation that had been missing in the early days of his reign. It was the kind of leadership we all hope for, a leader who learns from his mistakes and uses that hard-won wisdom to make things better for everyone. This period of peace also led to a significant expansion of Uruk's influence. Gilgamesh, now a skilled diplomat, forged alliances with neighboring city-states, creating a network of trade and cooperation that benefited everyone involved. The empire, though not yet called that, was growing not through conquest, but through culture and commerce. This was a new kind of power, a power that was based on mutual respect and shared prosperity. It was a soft power approach, a gentle giant that was far more effective than the aggressive, brutal tactics of the past. The legacy of Gilgamesh's change was now woven into the very fabric of the city and its surrounding regions. Scholars still debate the exact end of Gilgamesh's reign and the transition to the next ruler. There's no exact timestamp on when the torch was passed. But what is clear is that the groundwork for a long-lasting, stable civilization had been laid. The man who had once been so selfish and arrogant had, through his immense suffering, created a world for his people that was far more beautiful than anything he could have ever imagined. He had discovered that true greatness lies not in living forever, but in leaving something good behind for those who come after you. It's the lesson of a man who looked death in the face and decided to live with a purpose. His reign became the stuff of legend even in his own time, his name synonymous not just with strength, but with wisdom. He had not only built a city of stone, but he had also built a legacy of compassion and justice, a foundation that would support his descendants for generations to come. The Gilgamesh Empire, though it was still in its infancy, was born not from the ashes of war, but from the heart of a king who had finally learned what it meant to be a man. And as Gilgamesh's life came to a close, his people were now prepared for a future of continued peace and prosperity, a gift from a man who had once been a god. The passing of Gilgamesh, a man who had not only ruled but had also been transformed by his own life, ushered in a new chapter for Uruk. The reins of power were taken up by his descendants, a lineage that carried his name and, more importantly, his hard-won wisdom. Among them rose a figure who would come to define the next era. Lugalbanda, the name itself, Lugalbanda, translates roughly to young lord. But this was no ordinary lord. He was a king in the truest sense of the word, a ruler who built upon the foundation of peace and prosperity that Gilgamesh had so painstakingly established. While Gilgamesh's early reign was a wild roller coaster of divine intervention and personal turmoil, Lugalbanda's was more of a steady, upward climb. He was less the restless hero and more the cunning statesman, a man of strategic intellect rather than brute force. Historians still argue about the precise genealogical link between Gilgamesh and Lugalbanda, some suggesting he was a son, others a distant relative. But what is undeniable is that Lugalbanda inherited the empire at its zenith. The groundwork had been laid, the city walls were strong, the economy was booming, and the people were content. Lugalbanda's role was not to conquer new lands, but to manage and expand the influence of the empire through diplomacy and cultural exchange. He was the kind of leader who would rather broker a trade deal than wage a war, a refreshing change from the endless skirmishes of the past. He was a bit like a CEO who inherits a successful company, and instead of shaking everything up, he just makes the company run smoother and more efficiently. This was the era when the Gilgamesh Empire, though it was still centered on Uruk, began to truly spread its tendrils of influence across Mesopotamia. The empire was not a military juggernaut, but a cultural and economic powerhouse. Lugalbanda sent out envoys, not soldiers, to neighboring city-states. These envoys brought with them not demands, but offers of trade and technology. Uruk became the Silicon Valley of the ancient world, a center of innovation and learning. They perfected irrigation techniques, improved pottery-making methods, and their scribes refined the cuneiform writing system to a new level of complexity and elegance. The empire's wealth was no longer measured in conquered lands, but in the flow of goods and ideas. One of the great epics of this period, the tale of Lugalbanda himself, tells of his adventures and his rise to power, but it paints a very different picture from the one of Gilgamesh. Lugalbanda's epic is less about fighting monsters and more about a hero who gets lost during a military campaign and has to rely on his cunning and piety to survive. He doesn't kill beasts, he befriends them. He doesn't fight gods, he prays to them. This shift in narrative from a story of power to a story of wisdom and piety reflects the changing values of the empire. The people of Uruk, under Lugalbanda's rule, valued intelligence and resourcefulness as much as, if not more than, strength. Lugalbanda's reign was a long and peaceful one. He had the kind of quiet, steady leadership that doesn't make for dramatic stories, but makes for a stable and prosperous society. He built new temples and public gardens, and he made sure that the arts and sciences were well funded. He was a patron of the arts, a champion of education, and a father to his people. His empire was not a flash in the pan, but a well-oiled machine that ran on efficiency and cooperation. It was a golden era for Uruk, a time when the echoes of Gilgamesh's journey were not just a legend, but a living lesson. They were a people who had learned from their past and were now building a better future. Brick by painstaking brick, under Lugalbanda's peaceful reign, the Gilgamesh Empire reached its full cultural and political height, a true golden age. The empire's power was no longer a question of military might, but of intellectual and artistic superiority. Uruk was a hive of innovation, a center of learning where scholars gathered to debate philosophy and astronomers charted the stars. The very air seemed to hum with creative energy. It was a time of unprecedented peace, the kind of quiet stability that allows a civilization to flourish in ways that war and conquest never could. This golden age was marked by a new appreciation for the arts. Scribes, once merely record keepers, now wrote great works of literature, capturing the myths and legends of their people, including, of course, the epic of Gilgamesh himself. They were the storytellers of their time, the keepers of memory, and their meticulous work on clay tablets ensured that the tales would survive for thousands of years. Artisans sculpted beautiful reliefs and created intricate jewelry, each piece testament to the empire's immense wealth and skill. The empire's art wasn't just decorative. It was a way of expressing their identity, their history, and their values. It was a culture that valued beauty and knowledge, a place where a poet was as respected as a general. The empire's reach also expanded through commerce. Uruk's merchants traveled far and wide, their caravans carrying goods from the far-flung corners of the known world. They traded precious metals, rare spices, and fine textiles, all of which enriched the city and its people. This vast trade network was a diplomatic tool too. It fostered relationships with other city-states, creating a sense of shared prosperity that made war seem like a foolish and wasteful endeavor. The peace was not just a lack of conflict. It was a carefully constructed web of alliances and economic ties that made conflict unprofitable. Lugalbanda's reign was a masterclass in soft power. He understood that a kingdom's strength isn't just in its army, but in its ability to inspire and influence. He was a patron of the sciences, and under his rule, the Mesopotamian people made significant advancements in mathematics and engineering. They built canals and aqueducts that were masterpieces of hydraulic engineering, ensuring that the fertile lands around the Tigris and Euphrates remained productive. This wasn't a kingdom built on conquest, but on the simple, practical genius of its people. It's a bit like the difference between building a sandcastle with a bucket and shovel versus building an entire resort with a blueprint and a team of architects. The legacy of this golden age was a profound one. The Gilgamesh Empire, under the wise and peaceful rule of Lugalbanda, proved that a civilization could reach its peak, not through violence, but through a shared commitment to progress and prosperity. It was a time when the lessons of Gilgamesh's journey, the importance of humility, the value of friendship, and the acceptance of one's own mortality were not just abstract concepts, but the very principles that guided their society. They were a people who had learned from their ancestors' mistakes and had built something truly great from the wisdom gained. Scholars still debate whether this golden age was a direct result of Lugalbanda's unique leadership or simply the natural culmination of Gilgamesh's initial transformative reign. But the fact remains that for a brief, glorious period, the Gilgamesh Empire stood as a shining example of what a civilization could be. It was a time when the very idea of a hero shifted from a man who slayed monsters to a man who built a better world for his people. And that, in itself, is a story worth remembering. But all golden ages, no matter how bright, must eventually come to an end. The Gilgamesh Empire's long and prosperous twilight was a slow, almost imperceptible process. It wasn't a sudden cataclysm, a grand invasion, or a single, fatal mistake. Rather, it was a gradual decay, a slow unwinding of the very threads that had held it together. The empire, for all its wisdom and wealth, was still a human creation, and humans, as we know, are messy and prone to old habits. The quiet succession of wise kings began to give way to rulers more concerned with personal power than with the well-being of their people. The lessons of Gilgamesh's journey, once so central to their culture, began to fade into myth, becoming mere stories for children instead of guiding principles for leaders. The first signs of this decline were subtle. The careful alliances forged by Lugalbanda began to fray. Neighboring city-states, once partners in a prosperous trade network, began to see Uruk not as a leader, but as a rival. The spirit of cooperation was replaced by a creeping sense of competition. The focus of the rulers shifted from intellectual and cultural pursuits to military strength and territorial expansion, a return to the very kind of thinking that Gilgamesh had abandoned. The Great Walls, once a symbol of protection, were now a reminder of a need for defense, a psychological barrier between Uruk and a world that was becoming increasingly hostile. It was a bit like a group of friends who had a great run and then suddenly started to compete with each other, slowly poisoning the very friendship they once cherished. Internal strife also began to rear its ugly head. The peaceful transition of power, a hallmark of the Golden Age, was replaced by power struggles and political intrigue. Factions within the city, fueled by greed and ambition, began to undermine the central authority. The old system of consensus and cooperation was replaced by a cutthroat political landscape. The scribes, once the esteemed keepers of history, were now tasked with recording political machinations and royal gossip. It was a sad, slow descent from a society of scholars and artists to one of backstabbing and whispers. Externally, the pressures began to mount. Nomadic tribes, once easily kept at bay by the empire's diplomatic and military might, grew bolder. They saw the internal weakness and the external arrogance of the Uruk rulers and began to raid the outer territories, disrupting trade routes and siphoning off resources. The empire, once a beacon of stability, was now a target. The resources that had once been used for building temples and advancing science were now funneled into building bigger armies and stronger fortifications. The cycle of history, it seems, was repeating itself, and the empire was sliding back into the very patterns of conflict and brutality that Gilgamesh had transcended. Scholars still debate the precise cause of the Gilgamesh Empire's final downfall, but many point to a combination of internal decay and external pressure. It was not a single event, but a perfect storm of factors, a slow motion collapse that took place over many generations. The great city of Uruk, for all its magnificent walls and cultural achievements, was not immune to the forces of human nature. The very qualities that had made it great, humility, cooperation, and wisdom, were the first to be forgotten. The empire was a monument to a lesson that had been learned and then forgotten, a tragic and poignant reminder that a golden age is not a permanent state, but a fleeting, precious moment in time. The fragmentation of the Gilgamesh Empire was not a swift, clean break, but a slow and painful unraveling. The once unified network of city-states, bound by trade, and the shared legacy of a great king began to pull apart. The careful alliances that had defined the Golden Age dissolved, and the subtle rivalries that had long simmered beneath the surface finally boiled over. It was a domino effect of distrust and self-interest. City-states that had once looked to Uruk as a cultural and economic hub now began to assert their own independence, raising their own walls and raising their own armies. The unity was a memory, and the shared purpose was gone. It was like a big family that decides to split up and live on their own, only to find out that being apart is a lot harder than they thought it would be. The once dominant city of Uruk, for all its magnificent walls, found itself isolated. Its rulers, who had grown complacent in their power, were ill-equipped to handle this new landscape of constant conflict. They had forgotten the lessons of humility and diplomacy, and now they were paying the price. The empire's wealth, once a source of strength, was now a target. They were a fat, juicy apple in a world of hungry worms. The old trade routes, once so secure, were now fraught with peril, and the flow of goods that had sustained the city began to dry up. The city's population, once so proud and prosperous, began to feel the pinch of scarcity and the constant threat of war. The old heroic tales, once a source of inspiration, were now just a sad reminder of a time when their leaders were capable of doing great things. The story of Gilgamesh was still told, but its message of transformation and humility was lost in the din of war drums. It became a story of a great warrior, a hero who had slayed monsters and bulls, not a story of a man who had found wisdom through loss. The very essence of the empire's founding myth was distorted, a tragic reflection of the people's own decline. It's a bit like when you see a quote from a famous person and it's completely taken out of context to mean something the person never intended. This period was marked by constant skirmishes and political instability. The rulers of Uruk, once at the pinnacle of power, were now just one of many competing warlords. The focus of the government was no longer on building a better society, but on simply surviving. The great artistic and scholarly endeavors of the Golden Age were put on hold. The scribes who once recorded great epics were now busy cataloging troop movements and supply lines. It was a sad descent from a society that valued knowledge to a society that only valued strength. The empire, for all intents and purposes, was now a collection of warring city-states, and the dream of a unified civilization was a thing of the past. The final blow to the empire came not from a single enemy, but from the slow, steady erosion of its power and influence. The once powerful military, now stretched thin by internal and external conflicts, could no longer protect its borders. The great walls of Uruk, a symbol of Gilgamesh's legacy, were now a last line of defense against a world that had become hostile. The empire, which had risen from the wisdom of a single man, was now crumbling because that wisdom had been forgotten. The story of Gilgamesh, which was once a tale of a hero's journey to wisdom, had now become a tragic tale of an empire's journey to oblivion. Scholarly consensus holds that the ultimate fragmentation of the Gilgamesh Empire was an inevitable consequence of its leaders' failure to uphold the values that had made it great in the first place. The empire, for all its grandeur, was built on a fragile foundation of human wisdom. And when that wisdom was lost, the whole thing came crashing down. And so, the Gilgamesh Empire, a grand experiment in enlightened rule, crumbled into the dust of history. The great city of Uruk, for all its magnificent walls, eventually succumbed to the forces of time and constant conflict. Its once bustling streets grew quiet. Its great temples fell into disrepair, and the wind whispered through the ruins of a once great civilization. For thousands of years, the story of Gilgamesh, of his journey from tyrant to king, was lost to the world. The clay tablets that held his epic lay buried under layers of sand and forgotten soil, silent witnesses to a time when gods walked the earth and men dared to challenge their own mortality. The epic's rediscovery was not a single moment of triumph, but a long, painstaking process. It began in the mid-19th century, a time when European archaeologists, driven by a thirst for knowledge and a dash of colonial ambition, began to excavate the ancient ruins of Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These men, with their pith helmets and their shovels, were digging not just for treasure, but for the very roots of civilization. They uncovered a treasure trove of artifacts, statues, and most importantly, countless clay tablets covered in a strange, wedge-shaped writing. This writing was called cuneiform, and at the time, no one in the modern world could read it. It was a language lost to time, a secret that had been buried for millennia. One of the most important of these discoveries came from the site of Nineveh, the ancient capital of the Assyrian Empire. It was here, in the ruins of the library of King Ashurbanipal, that a young British archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard found thousands of cuneiform tablets. Among them, he found fragments of a long, narrative poem. The tablets were shattered, like a cosmic jigsaw puzzle, but they were there, a tangible link to a world that had been forgotten. The tablets were shipped back to the British Museum in London, where they sat for years, a fascinating but unreadable curiosity. It's a bit like finding a computer from a long-lost civilization, but not having the operating system to boot it up. It was an English Assyriologist named George Smith who finally cracked the code. He was a brilliant self-taught scholar who worked in the British Museum, and he had a fascination with the cuneiform tablets. In 1872, while piecing together a particularly difficult set of fragments, he stumbled upon a section that described a great flood, a story that sounded eerily similar to the one in the Bible about Noah's Ark. Smith was so excited by the discovery that he reportedly ran around the room, tearing off his clothes in a fit of pure scholarly ecstasy. It was a moment of profound revelation, a single spark that would ignite a fire of historical and theological debate that continues to this day. The translation of these tablets revealed not just a flood story, but an entire epic poem, a narrative that followed the journey of a hero king named Gilgamesh. The tablets told the story of his friendship with Enkidu, their battles with monsters, Gilgamesh's grief, and his desperate quest for immortality. It was a story that spoke of universal human themes: friendship, love, loss, and the fear of death. The rediscovery of the Gilgamesh epic was a bombshell. It pushed back the origins of written literature by thousands of years and forced scholars to re-examine what they knew about the ancient world. It was a testament to the fact that no matter how many centuries pass, a good story will always find a way to be told. Scholars still debate the full implications of George Smith's discovery, particularly the extent to which the Gilgamesh flood story influenced later religious texts. But what is undeniable is that the rediscovery of the epic opened a window into a world that had been lost for so long. It showed us that the concerns of our ancient ancestors were not so different from our own. They too grappled with the same questions about life and death, purpose and meaning. The epic was not just an archaeological find, it was a mirror, a reflection of the shared human experience. With the rediscovery of the Gilgamesh epic, the world gained access to a story that was not just ancient, but also profoundly influential. As scholars painstakingly translated the cuneiform tablets, they began to notice something remarkable. The themes and narrative elements of the epic were not unique to ancient Mesopotamia. They had, in fact, rippled through time, influencing later mythologies and literatures across different cultures. It was as if the story of Gilgamesh was a foundational text, a kind of cultural bedrock from which other great stories had grown. It was like finding the original blueprint for a house you'd seen 100 different versions of. One of the most immediate and startling connections was the flood story. Remember the section of the tablet that George Smith first translated, the one that told the tale of a man named Utnapishtim, who built an ark to survive a great flood sent by the gods. That narrative, with its striking similarities to the biblical story of Noah's Ark, sent shockwaves through the academic and religious worlds. The parallels were undeniable: a divine warning, a single family chosen for salvation, an ark built to specific dimensions, animals taken aboard, and a test with a raven and a dove after the waters subsided. Historians now largely believe that the biblical flood story was influenced by, or at least shares a common ancestor with, the Mesopotamian flood myth, with the Gilgamesh epic being one of its most famous iterations. This didn't just change how we saw the epic, it changed how we understood the origins of some of our most sacred stories. But the influence of Gilgamesh didn't stop there. The epic's central themes, the search for immortality, the confrontation with one's own mortality, the power of friendship, and the journey to wisdom, are universal. You can see echoes of Gilgamesh in countless later heroes. The Greek hero Heracles, for example, a demigod of immense strength who undertakes a series of impossible labors, feels like a distant cousin of Gilgamesh. The story of Achilles, a hero who grapples with his own mortality and loses a dear friend, Patroclus, to the cruelties of war, is a narrative that would have felt very familiar to the scribes who first wrote down Gilgamesh's story. The sorrow and rage that Achilles feels at the death of his friend is the same sorrow and rage that Gilgamesh felt when he lost Enkidu. It's a recurring pattern in human storytelling, a testament to the idea that some feelings are just timeless. Even in later epics, like Homer's The Odyssey, you can see the influence. The long, perilous journey of a hero to get home, the encounters with strange and magical creatures, and the transformation of the hero from a warrior to a wise man. All of these elements have a precedent in Gilgamesh's journey to find Utnapishtim. The epic was a kind of proto-hero's journey, a narrative template that would be used and reused for thousands of years. It was a story so powerful that it became a part of the cultural DNA of Western civilization, even though it was lost to time for so long. Scholarly debates still rage about the direct lines of influence versus independent invention, but the presence of these shared themes and narrative structures is hard to deny. The rediscovery of Gilgamesh provided a missing link, a way to connect the dots between the early, fragmented myths of the ancient world and the great works of literature that would follow. It was a reminder that even in the most ancient of stories, we can find a reflection of ourselves. The influence of Gilgamesh, a story that was lost for millennia, didn't stop at ancient literature. It has made a remarkable journey into our modern consciousness, finding new life and new meaning in the books, movies, and video games of today. This is a testament to the timeless power of the epic's themes. The story of a hero grappling with his own mortality, the profound bond of friendship, and the quest for purpose are just as relevant to us now as they were to the ancient Sumerians. It's like a piece of music that was composed thousands of years ago, but still has a melody that resonates with us today. In the world of fantasy and fiction, the echoes of Gilgamesh are everywhere. The archetype of the powerful, flawed hero who embarks on a quest for knowledge or an object of power is a staple of modern storytelling. Think about heroes like Conan the Barbarian, a wanderer of immense strength who finds himself in a world of gods and monsters. His adventures, his strength, and his journey through a vast and often brutal world are very much in the spirit of Gilgamesh. The modern genre of epic fantasy, with its themes of kings, quests, and mythical creatures, owes a significant debt to the world's oldest surviving epic. Even in more mainstream media, you can find direct references to the epic. In video games, for example, the character of Gilgamesh has appeared in countless forms, from a powerful swordsman in the Final Fantasy series to a boss character in games like Fate, Grand Order. He's a recurring figure in the gaming world, a symbol of immense power and often a bit of tragic arrogance. This shows that the character himself has a kind of inherent coolness that transcends time and medium. He's a name you can drop that immediately signals a certain kind of epic mythological power. In film and television, the epic has been reimagined and retold, often in pieces. The idea of a man-god grappling with his human side is a common trope in superhero movies. The hero who is so powerful that he has to be humbled, who must learn compassion to be a true leader, is a story we see again and again. It's the journey of a character who has everything but understands nothing until a great loss teaches him the true meaning of life. This is the core of Gilgamesh's journey, and it's a narrative that we, as modern audiences, still find compelling. Even the popular comic book series, The Eternals from Marvel Comics, which was recently adapted into a film, features a character named Gilgamesh. This Gilgamesh is a powerful, compassionate, and somewhat lonely being who is the protector of his people, a modern interpretation of the ancient king's final, wiser form. The story of the Eternals even touches on the idea of a great flood, a nod to the ancient epic that inspired it. Scholars still debate the degree to which these modern adaptations accurately reflect the original text. But what's clear is that the epic's themes are so potent and so deeply human that they can be transplanted into any era and still resonate. The story of Gilgamesh is no longer just an academic curiosity. It is a living, breathing part of our popular culture, a story that continues to evolve and inspire in new and unexpected ways. It's a testament to the power of a good story, that it can survive for millennia, be lost for a time, and then find new life in the strange, digital world we live in today. The rediscovery and translation of the Gilgamesh epic brought a truly mind-bending question to the forefront of scholarly debate. Was Gilgamesh a real person? This isn't a question with an easy yes or no answer. It's a topic that has fueled endless arguments among archaeologists, historians, and literary scholars for over a century. The lines between myth and history in ancient Mesopotamia are as blurry as an old photograph, and the epic itself, doesn't make it any easier to tell where one ends and the other begins. On one hand, there's compelling evidence to suggest that a historical king named Gilgamesh did indeed rule the city of Uruk. The Sumerian king list, an ancient text that chronicles the kings of Sumer, lists a ruler named Gilgamesh who reigned in the city of Uruk sometime around the 27th century BCE. He is said to have reigned for a staggering 126 years, a clear indication that at least some of the information is legendary, but his name is listed alongside other historical figures who are now confirmed to have existed. So, it's very plausible that there was a real historical king named Gilgamesh, a powerful ruler who left a lasting impression on his people. He might not have been two-thirds god, and he almost certainly didn't wrestle a celestial bull, but he likely existed. He was probably a great king, and his accomplishments were so grand that they were embellished and exaggerated over generations until they became the stuff of legend. It's a bit like the stories of King Arthur. We know there was a historical basis for the legend, but the details of the sword in the stone and the Lady of the Lake are clearly a bit of a stretch. On the other hand, the epic itself is so full of supernatural events and divine intervention that it's impossible to take it as a straight historical account. The journey to the cedar forest, the defeat of the Bull of Heaven, the quest to find an immortal man, and the encounter with a snake that steals the plant of youth. These are not things that happen in the real world. They are the elements of a myth, a story meant to teach a lesson about life and death, not to chronicle a king's life with historical accuracy. The Gilgamesh we read about in the epic is a mythological figure, a hero who transcends the boundaries of human experience. He is a symbol, a literary character, a personification of the human struggle against mortality. So, the scholarly debate boils down to this. Was the mythological figure of Gilgamesh based on a real person? Or was the name of a real king simply attached to an existing myth? There are strong arguments on both sides. Some scholars point to the existence of the king list and the detailed descriptions of Uruk's walls as evidence of a historical core. Others argue that the epic's primary purpose was philosophical and moral, not historical, and that the historical Gilgamesh, if he existed, was just a convenient name to hang the story on. Historians still argue whether the historical Gilgamesh was the direct inspiration for the epic, or simply a name used to lend credibility to an already existing myth. But most scholars agree that the epic, as we have it, is a work of literature, not a historical document. This doesn't make the story any less valuable. In fact, it makes it more so. It shows us that even in the most ancient of civilizations, people were already wrestling with the biggest questions of human existence, and were using the power of storytelling to try and find the answers. The enduring power of the Gilgamesh epic, a story that survived thousands of years in the dirt, lies in its profound and deeply human themes. While we can get lost in the academic debates about its historical accuracy or its influence on other stories, at its core, the epic is a story about friendship, grief, and the search for meaning. These are not just ancient ideas. They are universal truths that resonate with every single person, no matter where or when they live. The story of Gilgamesh is a mirror, and when we look into it, we see our own reflections, a bit dusty and a little tired, but still wrestling with the same questions that plagued the world's first recorded hero. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu is the heart of the story. It is a relationship so powerful that it can transform a cruel tyrant into a compassionate king. Enkidu, a man of the wild, a force of nature, becomes the civilizing force in Gilgamesh's life. He is the one who challenges him, who makes him a better man. Their bond is not just about shared adventure. It's about a deep, unconditional love that teaches both of them what it means to be truly human. The sorrow Gilgamesh feels at Enkidu's death is not the sorrow of a hero who has lost a sidekick. It is the raw, gut-wrenching grief of a man who has lost his other half. This is a feeling we all understand, a universal experience that transcends culture and time. The epic's confrontation with grief is unflinching and powerful. Gilgamesh's reaction to Enkidu's death is not a quick, tidy resolution. It is a messy, drawn-out, and deeply physical process. He weeps, he tears at his clothes, he lets his hair and beard grow long, and he refuses to let go of his friend's body until the bitter reality of decay forces him to. This is not a man who is getting over it. This is a man who is living it, and the epic gives us permission to do the same. It tells us that it is okay to fall apart in the face of loss, that grief is a natural and necessary part of the human experience. It is the part of the story that we, as modern people, need to remember the most. That it's okay not to be okay. And finally, the search for meaning. Gilgamesh's quest for immortality is not just about avoiding death. It is a deeper search for purpose, a desperate attempt to find a reason to live in a world where everything, even the greatest heroes, must eventually die. He is asking the big questions. What is the point of it all? Is there anything that truly lasts? His journey is a philosophical one, and the answer he finds is not what he expected. He learns that immortality is not something you can find or steal or win. It is something you create through the life you live, the friends you love, and the legacy you leave behind. His immortality is in his city, in his story, and in the wisdom he passed down to his people. It's a reminder that we don't have to live forever to be remembered forever. Our lives, no matter how short, can have a profound impact. Scholars still argue about the epic's original audience, but its timeless themes prove that it was written not just for the people of Uruk, but for every generation that would follow. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a story of a man who lived, loved, and lost, and in doing so, taught us what it means to be human. It's a story that continues to speak to us today, a quiet whisper from the past, reminding us to live our lives to the fullest and to cherish the people we love. The Gilgamesh Empire, a civilization that rose from the wisdom of a single king and then crumbled when that wisdom was forgotten, left behind a legacy far more powerful than its physical remains. Its enduring impact is not in its ruined cities or its broken walls, but in the story of its founder, a story that echoes across millennia. The Epic of Gilgamesh, a work of literature so old it feels like it belongs to another universe, is the Empire's greatest monument. It is a testament to the idea that a story, when it is profound enough, can outlast any empire, any king, any monument of stone and brick. The legacy of the empire is in the very idea of a hero's journey, the arc of a character who starts as an arrogant, selfish person and is transformed by suffering and loss, is the blueprint for countless stories that followed. Gilgamesh's journey from a tyrannical king who abused his power to a wise, compassionate leader who learned to value his people and to accept his own mortality is a lesson that every society, every generation must learn for itself. It is a story that tells us that true greatness is not in what you conquer, but in what you become. The epic's legacy is also in its fearless confrontation with the big, scary questions of human existence. It asks us to look at death not as a distant possibility, but as a stark reality that shapes our lives. It asks us, what is the point of it all if everything ends? And the answer it provides is a beautiful one. The point is in the journey itself. It is in the love you share with your friends, in the wisdom you gain from your failures, and in the legacy you leave behind. Gilgamesh, a man who failed in his quest for immortality, found a different kind of eternal life, an immortality that came from his story, from the wisdom he shared, and from the people who remembered him. The empire's intellectual and cultural achievements, though they faded from history for a time, are another part of its legacy. The advancements in writing, in astronomy, in mathematics, and in engineering were not just for the benefit of Uruk. They were a part of the slow, steady march of human progress. The people of Mesopotamia, inspired by their great king and his journey, were pioneers in the fields of science and art. They were a civilization that was not just powerful, but also smart, a combination that is rare and precious. They showed us that a society that values knowledge is a society that can achieve truly great things. Scholarly debates still rage about how much of the empire's cultural legacy was truly unique and how much was a product of the wider Mesopotamian civilization. But the fact remains that the Gilgamesh Empire, in its golden age, was a shining example of a society that valued intellectual and artistic pursuits as much as, if not more than, military conquest. Its greatest legacy is not a list of battles won, but a story that has transcended time, a story that continues to teach us about the things that truly matter. The Gilgamesh Empire, for all its short-lived glory, gave us a story that is, for all intents and purposes, immortal. And that is a legacy that no army could ever hope to conquer. The rediscovery of the Gilgamesh epic, which had been lost to the world for thousands of years, was a profound moment for humanity. It was a kind of homecoming, a quiet reunion with our oldest story. As scholars worked to translate the cuneiform tablets, they found something more than just a dusty old myth. They found a story that spoke to our shared humanity, a narrative that grappled with the same questions we still ask ourselves today. The story of Gilgamesh, a king who was part god and part man, is a beautiful reflection of the human condition, a story about the struggle to find meaning and acceptance in a world that is often chaotic and unjust. It's a reminder that even in the most ancient of times, people were just like us, wrestling with grief, searching for a purpose, and clinging to the hope of leaving a lasting mark on the world. The epic's greatest gift is its exploration of friendship. The relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu is the very heart of the narrative. It's a story about two opposites who are fated to meet and who, in their coming together, transform each other for the better. Enkidu, the wild man, is civilized by his friendship with Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh, the cruel tyrant, is made compassionate and wise by his love for Enkidu. Their bond is a love story in the truest sense of the word, a deep, transformative connection that proves that the most powerful thing a person can have is a true friend. When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh's grief is not a tidy, poetic sadness. It is a raw, physical, and deeply human sorrow. He weeps for 7 days and nights, refusing to let go of his friend's body. This is a scene that every person who has ever lost a loved one can understand. It is the kind of grief that knows no words, only a deep, abiding ache. It is an honest portrayal of loss, a gift from the ancient world that tells us that our grief is a part of what makes us human. The story also speaks to our timeless fascination with mortality. Gilgamesh's quest for immortality is not a selfish, narcissistic pursuit. It is a desperate flight from the terrifying reality of death, a reality that was brought home to him by the loss of his friend. He is a man who is so powerful, so strong, and so great that he can't accept that he, too, is vulnerable to the same fate as everyone else. His journey is a kind of rebellion against the natural order of the world, and in his failure to find eternal life, he finds something far more valuable: wisdom. He learns that the only way to achieve a kind of immortality is not to live forever, but to live a life that is so profound and so meaningful that it will be remembered forever. He learns that our legacy is not in our genes or in our monuments, but in the stories we tell, the people we love, and the kindness we show to others. It's a lesson that is just as relevant today as it was then. Scholars still argue about the epic's intended audience and its original purpose, whether it was a historical account, a moral lesson, or a bit of both. But the fact remains that the Gilgamesh epic, for all its ancient trappings, is a remarkably modern story. It is a story about a hero who is not a flawless god, but a deeply flawed human being who must learn the hard way that true strength is not in the size of your muscles, but in the humility of your heart. It's a quiet whisper from the past, a gentle reminder that we are all on a journey, and that the most important thing we can do is to live that journey with purpose and compassion. The enduring power of the Gilgamesh epic, a story that survived thousands of years in the dirt, lies in its profound and deeply human themes. While we can get lost in the academic debates about its historical accuracy or its influence on other stories, at its core, the epic is a story about friendship, grief, and the search for meaning. These are not just ancient ideas. They are universal truths that resonate with every single person, no matter where or when they live. The story of Gilgamesh is a mirror, and when we look into it, we see our own reflections, a bit dusty and a little tired, but still wrestling with the same questions that plagued the world's first recorded hero. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu is the heart of the story. It is a relationship so powerful that it can transform a cruel tyrant into a compassionate king. Enkidu, a man of the wild, a force of nature, becomes the civilizing force in Gilgamesh's life. He is the one who challenges him, who makes him a better man. Their bond is not just about shared adventure, it's about a deep, unconditional love that teaches both of them what it means to be truly human. The sorrow Gilgamesh feels at Enkidu's death is not the sorrow of a hero who has lost a sidekick. It is the raw, gut-wrenching grief of a man who has lost his other half. This is a feeling we all understand, a universal experience that transcends culture and time. The epic's confrontation with grief is unflinching and powerful. Gilgamesh's reaction to Enkidu's death is not a quick, tidy resolution. It is a messy, drawn-out, and deeply physical process. He weeps, he tears at his clothes, he lets his hair and beard grow long, and he refuses to let go of his friend's body until the bitter reality of decay forces him to. This is not a man who is getting over it. This is a man who is living it, and the epic gives us permission to do the same. It tells us that it is okay to fall apart in the face of loss, that grief is a natural and necessary part of the human experience. It is the part of the story that we, as modern people, need to remember the most. That it's okay not to be okay. And finally, the search for meaning. Gilgamesh's quest for immortality is not just about avoiding death. It is a deeper search for purpose, a desperate attempt to find a reason to live in a world where everything, even the greatest heroes, must eventually die. He is asking the big questions. What is the point of it all? Is there anything that truly lasts? His journey is a philosophical one, and the answer he finds is not what he expected. He learns that immortality is not something you can find or steal or win. It is something you create through the life you live, the friends you love, and the legacy you leave behind. His immortality is in his city, in his story, and in the wisdom he passed down to his people. It's a reminder that we don't have to live forever to be remembered forever. Our lives, no matter how short, can have a profound impact. Scholars still argue about the epic's original audience, but its timeless themes prove that it was written not just for the people of Uruk, but for every generation that would follow. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a story of a man who lived, loved, and lost, and in doing so, taught us what it means to be human. It's a story that continues to speak to us today, a quiet whisper from the past, reminding us to live our lives to the fullest and to cherish the people we love. The Gilgamesh Empire, a grand experiment in enlightened rule, crumbled into the dust of history. The great city of Uruk, for all its magnificent walls, eventually succumbed to the forces of time and constant conflict. Its once bustling streets grew quiet. Its great temples fell into disrepair, and the wind whispered through the ruins of a once great civilization. For thousands of years, the story of Gilgamesh, of his journey from tyrant to king, was lost to the world. The clay tablets that held his epic lay buried under layers of sand and forgotten soil, silent witnesses to a time when gods walked the earth and men dared to challenge their own mortality. The epic's rediscovery was not a single moment of triumph, but a long, painstaking process. It began in the mid-19th century, a time when European archaeologists, driven by a thirst for knowledge and a dash of colonial ambition, began to excavate the ancient ruins of Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These men, with their pith helmets and their shovels, were digging not just for treasure, but for the very roots of civilization. They uncovered a treasure trove of artifacts, statues, and most importantly, countless clay tablets covered in a strange, wedge-shaped writing. This writing was called cuneiform, and at the time, no one in the modern world could read it. It was a language lost to time, a secret that had been buried for millennia. One of the most important of these discoveries came from the site of Nineveh, the ancient capital of the Assyrian Empire. It was here, in the ruins of the library of King Ashurbanipal, that a young British archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard found thousands of cuneiform tablets. Among them, he found fragments of a long narrative poem. The tablets were shattered like a cosmic jigsaw puzzle, but they were there, a tangible link to a world that had been forgotten. The tablets were shipped back to the British Museum in London, where they sat for years, a fascinating but unreadable curiosity. It's a bit like finding a computer from a long-lost civilization, but not having the operating system to boot it up. It was an English Assyriologist named George Smith who finally cracked the code. He was a brilliant, self-taught scholar who worked in the British Museum, and he had a fascination with the cuneiform tablets. In 1872, while piecing together a particularly difficult set of fragments, he stumbled upon a section that described a great flood, a story that sounded eerily similar to the one in the Bible about Noah's Ark. Smith was so excited by the discovery that he reportedly ran around the room, tearing off his clothes in a fit of pure scholarly ecstasy. It was a moment of profound revelation, a single spark that would ignite a fire of historical and theological debate that continues to this day. The translation of these tablets revealed not just a flood story, but an entire epic poem, a narrative that followed the journey of a hero king named Gilgamesh. The tablets told the story of his friendship with Enkidu, their battles with monsters, Gilgamesh's grief, and his desperate quest for immortality. It was a story that spoke of universal human themes: friendship, love, loss, and the fear of death. The rediscovery of the Gilgamesh epic was a bombshell. It pushed back the origins of written literature by thousands of years and forced scholars to re-examine what they knew about the ancient world. It was a testament to the fact that no matter how many centuries pass, a good story will always find a way to be told. Scholars still debate the full implications of George Smith's discovery, particularly the extent to which the Gilgamesh flood story influenced later religious texts. But what is undeniable is that the rediscovery of the epic opened a window into a world that had been lost for so long. It showed us that the concerns of our ancient ancestors were not so different from our own. They too grappled with the same questions about life and death, purpose and meaning. The epic was not just an archaeological find, it was a mirror, a reflection of the shared human experience. The legacy of the Gilgamesh Empire, though its physical form has long since crumbled to dust, is an astonishing one. It is a legacy that defies the very laws of time and decay, a testament to the power of a story well told. The empire's greatest monument is not a ziggurat or a statue, but a series of clay tablets that, through a miraculous set of circumstances, survived for over 4,000 years. These tablets, which told the story of a man's journey from tyrant to king, from fear to wisdom, became the philosophical and cultural blueprint for a civilization that would last for centuries. The story of Gilgamesh, a legend born in the crucible of a lost empire, became the very thing he had so desperately sought. Immortal. The enduring power of the epic lies in its profound lessons. It teaches us that true strength is not in the size of your muscles or the might of your army, but in the humility of your heart. It teaches us that friendship is a bond so powerful it can transcend the very nature of a man and transform him into something greater. And most importantly, it teaches us to confront the reality of our own mortality, not with fear, but with a quiet dignity. Gilgamesh's journey, a desperate flight from death, ends in a profound acceptance of it. He learns that the only way to leave a lasting mark on the world is not to live forever, but to live a life that is so full of purpose and meaning that it will be remembered forever. His immortality is in his story, in the wisdom he passed down to his people, and in the legacy he left behind. The empire's legacy is also in its intellectual and artistic achievements, which are woven into the fabric of Western civilization. The scribes of Uruk, who perfected the cuneiform writing system, gave us not just a way to record history, but a way to express our deepest thoughts and feelings. The astronomers who charted the stars, and the mathematicians who created the foundations for modern algebra, were not just working for their king. They were contributing to a larger human project, a slow, steady march toward progress and knowledge. The Gilgamesh Empire, in its golden age, was a shining example of what a society could be when it values intellectual and artistic pursuits as much as, if not more than, military conquest. It showed us that a society that values knowledge is a society that can achieve truly great things. And so, we come to the end of our story. The Gilgamesh Empire rose and fell, and its people are long gone. But its story, a story of a hero who was flawed and human, and who learned to be great, remains. It is a story that has survived for millennia, a quiet whisper from the past, reminding us that we are all on a journey, and that the most important thing we can do is to live that journey with purpose and compassion. So, as you drift off to sleep, remember the king who walked with gods and wrestled with monsters, the man who found his humanity in the loss of his friend and his immortality in the story of his life, the world's first recorded hero, the king who walked among gods and men, now sleeps in the quiet halls of history. His city of Uruk, once a bustling monument to his greatness, has long since returned to the earth from which it came. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the silent witnesses to his epic journey, still flow to the sea, but their waters have washed away the footprints of a lost civilization. The story is over. The last tablet has been read, and the final echoes of his journey have faded into the gentle rustle of the wind. Just like Gilgamesh, our own stories are fleeting, but the memories we create and the kindness we show, they last. So, as the world outside grows quiet, close your eyes and let your mind drift to the ancient, star-filled skies over Mesopotamia, a sky that once watched a hero's quest and now watches over you. Let the ancient dust settle, and the long-ago sounds of the city of Uruk fade into a soft silence. Rest now,